Good morning and welcome to episode 50, 60 of the Anno Domini podcast. It's good to have you with us today. And let me go straight to the point. We've been this week diving into a couple of direct quotations from these 5 books. The first one we did on Monday, The Post-American World by Fareed Zakaria. He was talking about, again, first of all, he wrote the book in 1991, which is 30 years ago plus, and a lot has changed, but a lot of his analysis of the world in the upcoming 30 years after he wrote the book came true, and it was proven true. Many of his assertions and analysis were proven true. The second one was, we did that on Tuesday, Peter Zion's book, The End of the World is Just a Beginning, Mapping the Collapse of Globalization. Now, Zion somehow, although not intentionally, but he reviews a couple of positions and analysis that Fareed Zakaria had taken 30 years earlier. Remember that Peter Zion's book was published in 2022. So he was revising several points that Zechariah was bringing to our attention when he wrote the book. And again, the way he reads what is coming on the future, the remaining of this decade between now and 2030, and then between 2030 and 2040, the 10-year decade between now and 2040, 15, 16 years, I believe that Peter Zion has a very good and a very close to reality type of understanding and analysis, unless something catastrophic happens that completely changes the spectrum and the destiny of nations, like a nuclear war, for example. Unless something that catastrophic happens, if things keep going the way they are, America doing the same, meaning retreating from the international or the globalized world and back to herself, meaning nationalism, that is where we're walking toward. And that is the book by Peter Zion. The third book, yesterday we read portions of it, Post-Christian Nation. Again, this guy is a Christian. Fareed Zakaria and Peter Zion are not Christians. And they did not write their books based on any religious perspective. Pastor Mark Stelter did. So he wrote about a pagan country, a country that is not anymore aligned with Christian principles, as it has been America's reality for almost 250 years now, in terms of the independent set of countries, first of states, first the 13 states, now 50 states. So he is talking about the foundations that he doesn't see there anymore. He doesn't see the Christian principles, the Christian values based on or seen in politics, in education, in whatever area of the society it is, social aspects, moral aspects. He's saying it's all almost gone, and probably we're not going to recognize this nation anymore, which is today's book, Pagan America, The Decline of Christianity and the Dark Age to Come. And this is a book by John Daniel Davidson, this one here. And I would like to bring to you and to your attention what he brings in the introduction of the book. It's a long one. I'm not going to read all of it, but just a couple of portions here. So here how he starts the book. He starts the book with, let me change this. He starts the book with a quote from G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton is a guy that I read very much in the past when I was in college. This is almost 30 years ago now, 25 years ago. So Chesterton said, and he starts the book with that quote. He says, let me break my glasses here. The quote says, "Some say it is impossible to return to the past. But the truth is that there is now nothing before us but the choice between two paths which both return to the past. We can return to some sort of Christian fellowship, or we can return to some sort of pagan slavery. There is no third road. And remember that Chesterton wrote this last century. So last century, 100 years ago, Chesterton was already understanding where the Western society was going. He was not an American, he was a British guy, so he was writing specifically about Europe, but of course he was also applying that same principle to the United States of America. And these are John Daniel Davidson's introduction to his book. He says, "A New Dark Age. The argument of this book is straightforward. America was founded not just on certain ideals, but on a certain kind of people, a predominantly Christian people, and it depends for its survival on their moral virtue, without which the entire experiment in self-government will unravel. As Christianity fades in America, so too will our system of government, our civil society, and all our rights and freedoms. Without a national culture shaped by Christian faith, without a majority consensus in favor of traditional Christian morality, America as we know it will come to an end. Instead of free citizens in a republic, we will be slaves in a pagan empire." Perhaps that sounds dramatic, but it is true nevertheless. There is no secular utopia waiting for us in the post-Christian world now coming into being. No future in which we get to retain the advantages and benefits of Christendom without the faith from which they sprang. Western civilization and its accoutrements depend on Christianity, not just in the abstract, but in practice. Liberalism, he says, relies on a source of vitality that does not originate from it and that it cannot replenish. That source is the Christian faith, in the absence of which we will revert to an older form of civilization, one in which power alone matters and the weak and the vulnerable count for nothing. What awaits us on the other side of Christendom, in other words, is a pagan dark age. Here, in the second decade of the 21st century, we can say with some confidence that this dark age has begun. And I fully agree with him. Let me keep going. I'm skipping some pages here. Indeed, past generations of Americans understood well the debt we owed to the faith of our fathers and constantly sought to affirm it in public and inculcate it into the next generation. They knew our survival depended on it. President Calvin Coolidge, speaking on the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, called it, quote, "the product of the spiritual insight of the people." America in 1926 was booming in every way, with great leaps forward, not just in economic prosperity, but in science and technology. But all these material things, said Coolidge, the 30th President of the United States of America, came from the Declaration. The things of the Spirit comes first, he said. And then he leveled a stark warning to his countrymen. So remember that Calvin Coolidge is writing this 100 years ago. He says, quote, "Unless we cling to that, all our material prosperity, overwhelming though it may appear, will turn to a barren scepter in our grasp. If we are to maintain the great heritage which has been bequeathed to us, we must be like-minded as the fathers who created it. We must not sink into a pagan materialism. We must cultivate the reverence which they had for the things that are holy. We must follow the spiritual and moral leadership which they showed. We must keep replenished, that they may glow with a more compelling flame, the altar fires before which they worshiped. End quote. Nearly a century later, it's clear that we have failed to cultivate the reverence our fathers had for the things that are holy, and we have indeed sunk into a pagan materialism. What comes next is a pagan slavery, which now looms over the Republic like a great storm cloud, ready to break. And when it breaks and the deluge comes, though, Christians at least need not fear. Christ himself came into a pagan world that regarded his message with contempt and incomprehension. His followers, and in those fires, a faith was forged that would topple the greatest pagan empire ever known, and amid its ruins, build something greater yet. In a television address in 1974, the Venerable Fulton J. Sheen, was a Catholic bishop, he said, then nearly 80 years old, declared, quote, "We are at the end of Christendom." So this is 1974, meaning 50 years. This Catholic spiritual leader said, "We are at the end of Christendom." And he defined Christendom as, quote, "an economic, political, social life as inspired by Christian principles. That," he said, "is ending. We have seen it die. Look at the symptoms: the breakup of the family, divorce, abortion, immorality, general dishonesty. We live in it from day to day." This is 1974, guys. "And we do not see the decline," end quote. Half a century has passed since Sheen said this, which might not belong in the lifespan of a religion founded 2,000 years ago, meaning Christianity, but then it only takes the lifespan of a single generation for much of it to be lost. And much has been lost in the last half century. The symptoms are now much worse than they were in 1974 in ways that Sheen himself might not have foreseen. But he was right. That is, it's hard to see the decline when you live in it day to day, and it is hard to see where it's heading. The purpose of this book, Daniel says, the purpose of this book is to help the reader see the decline, understand what it pretends, and prepare accordingly. What follows is hard medicine, but it is not a counsel of despair. For Christians familiar with their own history, nothing is ever really cause for despair, not even the loss, if it comes to that, of the American Republic. History, as J.R. Tolkien said in one of his letters, is for Christians and I'm quoting Tolkien here, "a long defeat, though it contains, and in a legend may contain more clearly and movingly, some samples or glimpses of final victory," end quote. What Tolkien meant by this, in part, is that we cannot in the end vanquish or eradicate evil. Our world, like Tolkien's Middle-earth, is a world in decline, marred by sin and corruption, and broiled in a rebellion against God. But as Christians, We repose our hope in a God who can and indeed already has conquered sin and death. So we await the dawn, and in the meantime, we fight the long defeat. Amid that fight, we are not without reason for hope. In his speech, Bishop Sheen, explained how the church dies and rises again, that it, quote, proceeds on the principles of Christ himself as priest and as victim, end quote. Over the many centuries of Christendom, there have been periods of great upheaval and chaos, times when it seemed that perhaps the Christian faith itself would be lost to pagan persecution, to Muslim conquest, to the fracturing forces of the Reformation, to the century of religious warfare it unleashed. Yet each time, the faith has survived, just as it will survive the de-Christianization of the West and the new rise of a pagan America. Sheen reminded his listeners of this and urged them not to despair, but to give thanks for, quote, these are great and wonderful days in which to be alive. It is not a gloomy picture. It is a picture of the church in the midst of increasing opposition from the world. And therefore, live your lives in the full consciousness of this hour of testing and rally close to the heart of Christ. So this is another amazing book, Pagan America, The Declining of Christianity and the Dark Age to Come. And I believe that that is what we should be preparing for. I also agree with him, John Daniel and Bishop Sheen and several others, leaders, spiritual leaders or political leaders, philosophers, historians, that the way they see our Western world right now, everything points to one reality only. And that reality is this is increasingly a de-Christianized part of the world. Which means that a lower Christian level, if I could say that, in a country or in a portion of the world will mean the rise of something else. And the rise of something else right now, yes, it's paganism. But if you remember in the beginning of Christianity, when right after Jesus ascended back to the throne of the Father and he left here the disciples and the apostles to start preaching and expanding the word of the kingdom of God. So those were days when Paul, for example, is arguing with the philosophers in Athens, in Greece. He is looking at gods that they had in a plaza filled with statues of gods, different Greek gods. And he sees one sign saying to the unknown God, and there was no statue there. And then he makes the point of, and he starts preaching, hey, this is the God that you don't know. That is the God that I do know. Although he is invisible, he is the creator of everything. He doesn't need a statue. He is not somebody to be put on a plaza, on a statuary hall, so to speak, right? So the people, the Greeks, the Romans, the Jews, everybody back then, the Jews that were not followers, of course, of the Mosaic law or Christianity, people back then, they were pagans and they would worship gods. So they understood that there were gods or powers, forces that transcended humanity, although they were all false gods. Today, with the rise of secularism, with the rise and the consolidation of humanism, humans now are gods. Reason now is God. So there is no God past humanity, right? God somehow is dead as one major philosopher said that was 2 centuries ago, God is dead, meaning God does not interfere anymore in human affairs. So when you don't have a God, and when you don't have a Christianity, when you don't have a Christian nation, as it is happening right here in America, you start worshiping ourselves. We start worshiping ourselves. We start worshiping our humanity. We start making ourselves gods and supplanting and taking God out of his throne and sitting on the throne ourselves. And so in a sense, we are in a much worse situation than the folks were 2,000 years ago when Paul was preaching to them about the unknown God. But at the same time, with the darkness that is growing and intensifying around us, this is, as John Daniel Davidson says, this is exactly the moment for the light of Christ to shine. Isaiah chapter 60 verses 1 and 2 says, "Arise and shine, for the glory of God shines on you." And he says, verse 2, "Because darkness covered the earth." In order for light to shine the brighter, we need darkness. I was just ministering to my beloved friends in Andrews last night, and we were talking about that. In order for Christ's light to shine, the more intense darkness is, the more the light will shine brighter. The more sin abounds, the more grace superabounds. So we are in an exquisite, peculiar, singular, absolutely powerful moment in history when persecution arises, the church arises stronger than ever before. And albeit there will be persecutions and people being damaged, tortured, hurt, Christians being persecuted. If we see that again in our days, this is just a wonderful sign that God is on the move again among us in the Western world. So we should cheer up. We should be encouraged by that. And we should allow the Lord to use us in a more powerful way than he ever has used us in the past, in this hour, in this time, in this season. So tomorrow we're going to be reading It's Midnight in America, the introduction of this book. Again, this is another Pastor Phil Hotzenpiller, or Hotzenpiller. I believe it's Hotzenpiller. Let me just read it the way it is, and probably I'm reading it wrong, but we're going to read some portions of his book because he's going to align pretty much with these 4 guys in different arenas, coming from different perspectives. But the message here is just one and the same. We are now living in a post-Christian, post-American world, especially in the West, but a post-Christian America and a post-powerful American empire in the world. What is coming on in our horizon? I don't know. Nobody knows. But I believe that we should be prepared for whatever comes, and especially to ground our faith in God and to ground our feet on solid ground as we never did before, so that people around us can see the shining light of Christ in us, because people out there will need people like you and me to guide them and to bring them to the Christ that can not only save, but the one that makes us co-heirs of his kingdom with him. May the Lord bless you, and I hope to see you here tomorrow for our last episode of this week's series on these 5 books. See you there. Bye-bye.